Great.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Aware Athlete Show. And today I'm very happy and very pleased to have with us Donna Brooks. And Donna has been, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've been practicing yoga for 40 years and teaching somatics for 30 years or so.
Mhm.
We're in the ballpark there. So,
Yeah.
Donna, you have an interesting story, an interesting backstory on how you got into somatics in the first place. Before we talk about what somatics is, maybe we could visit your story. I know that you don't mind telling it because it's on your website. So you were born and immediately placed for adoption. My mother was adopted. Her name was Mona Height, but her name before the adoption was Mary White. So
Mm.
so they just changed it slightly. And but she grew up in a fairly stable household, and your story is different. So
Yeah.
you were placed for adoption, and we know. Go ahead and could you go ahead with that story?
Yeah. My mother got pregnant with a married man,
Mhm.
and she had hoped that he would leave his wife for her. And, that's kind of
Yeah.
highly unlikely. And so she placed me up for adoption. And then I was with an adoptive family for 6 months. At which point, my father started making promises to her, which he didn't keep. But she took me away. She had a little window where she could still get me back. So she got me back, but there was no marriage or nuclear family in the horizon. So basically, my grandmother raised me, and she was very bitter about it. There's a lot of shame, a lot of feeling of, this is something that's very wrong that happened. So they left their home in New York City and Queens. They had friends in New York and in Queens, and they moved out to Long Island. And I grew up with this mythology that my father had died, which never made sense because there were no pictures of him anywhere. And my mother refused to talk about him. And it wasn't until, oh gosh, I think 2013 that I actually met my father right before he died.
Right. So so you're put up for adoption. You might have been able to live with that, but that's traumatic.
It is traumatic. So what happened was so I left a long-term marriage in 2009. And I embarked really on a lot of healing. And though I had always been in sort of yoga and somatics and movement and meditation, I never really approached the deep internal psychological pieces until I left my husband, my then husband. And um, so, as part of my healing, I went to a homeopath in Boston for something completely different. I forget what it was, something very mundane. But when I told her my story, she told me that I see, I always felt like I was like shattered. And I couldn't understand it because, when you grow up, I grew up in the suburbs of New York, and I mean, people had issues. Like there was a lot of alcoholism, or I remember I had a girlfriend, like a couple of girlfriends now in retrospect, I realized that there was some kind of like incest or sexual abuse. I didn't have that. But yet, so I couldn't understand why I just felt this shatteredness and why I didn't have this ground of being. And so this homeopathic gave me a book actually about the trauma of adoption, which now I feel so passionate about because I saw that Amy Coney Barrett, in the whole kind of Supreme Court abortion thing, she's like, oh, just adopt. And I know from my experience, and I've read about others now too, is that that disconnection with the mother that you grew inside of is deeply traumatic. And I'm not saying that you should never, have adoption. Adoption can be very important and wonderful, but that trauma needs to be addressed because it is a trauma. And mine didn't get addressed until, I was well into my 50s. And the homeopath, Begabati Lenahan, she's an amazing homeopath. If I know some people will react negatively towards homeopathy, but I've used it. And she gave me a remedy that I looked up, and I was like, I'm not going to take this remedy because it was not a flattering picture of the person who would need this remedy. But I took it, and I just had this amazing experience where first I just felt incredible anger. And I wrote a bunch of angry letters. And then a friend of mine was giving a talk at a cafe. So I went to the cafe, but as soon as I walked in there, I couldn't stay. I was looking at the case, seeing if I wanted to buy something. And I just broke out into tears, ran to my car, and must have cried for 20 minutes. And since then, I do not experience that level of shattering, like something deeply healed from that tear. And it was that tear that really, kept me in a less than full expression of my life
Yeah.
for decades.
So, and that was your, since that experience with the homeopath. Yeah. Okay. And that started you on a different path. So it reminds me of the saying, love heals a multitude of sins or errors. The caring, right?
There was something in that remedy. It created a kind of portal through which I had a really profound experience. I mean, I was doing a lot of other work too. I was, in therapy. I have a personal practice of body mind centering, Bonnie Cohen's work, and I was doing a lot of repatterning developmental movements, from early childhood. So it wasn't like it was the only thing I did, but there was something about that remedy that just shook me. And when it shook me, it just broke something. I don't know if it would have worked like that if I wasn't already doing all the kind of adjunct other things I was doing pretty
Yeah. So it might have
committedly.
been really synergistic.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think most things in life are synergistic,
I
for
think
sure.
they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
So before that, we carry things with us that we're not fully conscious of a lot of times, and uh, pain gets stuffed inside, I think, in a deep place where, because you have to go on, and so you put it away, but it's there.
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so was it your grandparents or just your grandmother?
I had grandparents,
Yeah, grandparents.
but my grandfather was quite a wonderful presence mostly in my life. It was really my grandmother who, she was embarrassed and resentful and very unhappy about
Yeah.
the situation.
So if she was very unhappy, she could not possibly have communicated to you stability and happiness and
Right.
those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I just want to stay on that for just a minute. Uh, See if you can identify this. I want to bring out more of your trauma a little bit. Just dwell on it for a minute. But my wife lost her mom when she was 9, and her dad was an alcoholic, and
Mm.
so he married another alcoholic.
Oh,
She needed a
fun
mom.
times.
What?
God,
Yeah,
fun times.
yeah. And he was a hard worker. He kept a job almost all the time. But those two, I knew them, and they you could just sit and listen to them berate each other all day.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
my wife's father did love her. My wife's new stepmother was did everything she could to just demolish her self-image with
Mm.
a very tough situation. Tell me how you can
Yeah.
relate to something like that.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
How
How
you can
you,
relate to that kind of a traumatic experience.
it's interesting because I think in my work, well, first I want to say a couple of other things. I want to say that, I don't know if you saw this from my website or not, but my son died in
You did. Yeah.
2020. And the pain of that has really put everything else in perspective. Like the loss of that is so great, that it really makes everything else that have happened that's been adverse in my life, um, very much less prominent.
Yeah.
And my experience, and maybe it's just the people that I work with, but I find that most people have, something that they really feel when they were young was like ripped out of them. Something that they were shamed for, or something they were denied, something that was ridiculed, something that was taken away. And I don't mean to like equalize it, because I know, some people have had extreme circumstances,
Mhm.
growing up in war zones, or,
Yeah.
as I mentioned before, the girls who were, sexually abused by family members. But this kind of theme of loss
Mhm.
and betrayal, I think what I have come to now is that that's just life. That some of us have maybe a more dramatic, or some people, definitely people have different levels of sensitivity too. Some people are cut more to the bone than other people, but we all have something. I don't know if I've met anyone that lives through their childhood unscathed.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
and
none
so,
of us had the absolutely perfect home.
yeah, so it's now, I just think that, that scarring or cutting or severing or whatever it is tied into the mystery of being here. I don't know that we get the goodies, without the difficulty. I don't know that that answers your question, but it's, I think I experience it as, certainly people have specific things. Like when my son died, I went to a bereavement group, and it wasn't the right bereavement group for me, because pretty much everyone who was there had lost a child to either drugs or suicide. And that's not how I lost my son. So I could see that there's a certain kind of clustering, like, oh, if you've had that particular experience that you've lost someone in a certain way, you might want to be around people who, also have that. And we all have loss,
Yeah,
so, and we all have loss, and we all have disappointment, and we all have betrayal, and, we all at least have trauma with a little t, for some people it's with a big T.
that's right. That's right. And even if you had suffered the same situation at a different point in life, it would have been a different experience.
That's true too.
Yeah. Yeah. So that
Yeah,
what you're saying is everything is terrifically individual, but the universal aspect is what? Just
we all have some kind of tearing. We all,
absolutely. I think so.
yeah.
So that story of losing your son is on your website too. So can you tell me how, because time marches on, as they say, you don't get over something like that, but you do move forward in time. How can you describe what that journey was like?
That journey, I attribute a lot to somatics. And I will tell you that my first actual introduction to somatic work was the Washington, D.C. Feldenkrais Center. I was taking, a lot of Iyengar yoga. I had been a dancer in college. I had, of course, injuries, because no one ever talked to me about how my body actually was supposed to move. It was all like
Yeah.
perform these feats. And, so I started doing Iyengar yoga, which was pretty remarkable, but I missed moving. And I heard of this thing called Feldenkrais, and I went to the Washington, DC Feldenkrais Center and fell in love. And if I had had the resources at that time to become a Feldenkrais practitioner, I so would have, but I didn't. And I took whatever I could from those classes and made them my own, and kind of, without calling it anything, integrated them into the Iyengar yoga classes I was teaching, which meant that the Iyengar yoga classes had to be at least 2 hours long. And
Yeah.
and so
Is that-
somatics,
yeah.
go ahead.
Is that Ayurveda? I say that again.
Oh, Iyengar, he was, oh my goodness, he, BKS Iyengar, he wrote the book Light on Yoga. And I think his integrity has really held up really strongly in the realm of yoga teachers who have had scandals, Indian yoga teachers. He's Indian, or he was. I think he died around maybe 217. But he, before, so when I started studying yoga, Hatha yoga, in the late 70s, there was no alignment. There were no props. There were no restorative yoga. Like, all of that, to the best of my knowledge, came from BKS. Like, things people take for granted in yoga teaching now, he really originated. And he was very clear about yoga being something you do for yourself to make yourself a better person. There was not, I mean, certainly traditionally he was like Guruji, but he was not someone you had to give, service to, or
Right.
he was kind of more Western that way from the get-go.
So
And
you're mentioning people that others have probably not heard of. Gurjeet.
that's amazing, but to me, but yeah, he was really, but yoga lacked the movement, and yoga lacked the idea of, as Thomas Hada said so eloquently, moving from the inside out, rather than it being imposed on you. What is the impulse, the intelligence of the organism, and
Yeah.
and I read The Elusive Obvious, As a matter of fact, my son considered naming his political podcast The Elusive Obvious. Yeah, so somatics got me through a lot. Somatic movement, experiencing my body as an organism that was going through.
Okay, so
and I don't,
let me
yeah, go
stop
ahead.
for just a second. I don't know, all our listeners won't be familiar with this. So The Elusive Obvious is a book by Moshe Feldenkrais, in which he talks about the difference in living compulsively, just being carried from one thing to another and by habit, or having choice. He called it spontaneity, or some other. Anyway, so it's a book worth checking out.
Yeah, it's one of
so much.
the classics of the field.
Everybody who's listening won't know.
Yeah.
So go ahead and express yourself.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I think it was all those years I had of kind of like, another really profound, important teacher to me has been Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, the School for Body Mind Centering. And I think like what I've learned a lot from that book, from that work, is to step back and introduce, as with Feldenkrais too, introduce something to my body, be conscious about it, and then let my body respond to that through movement. And with the movement also comes emotion. Sometimes it might be little emotion, like this is really pleasant, and other times it could be like, whoa, I just hit something I never even knew was there, and it's going to express itself. But somehow I learned to trust in the intelligence of the organism, that I would just have to give it a little, a little something, and it could lead me through. And I really feel that continues to lead me through my son's death.
Yeah. So by the time something happened with your son, you already had some tools to deal with life.
Oh, many.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And doesn't that help?
So much.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah.
And I also read I don't even know who I was reading, but I read, well, two things that were really impactful for me. And one thing was the idea that, I know this word is overused, but that loss is a trauma. And I started realizing that the intelligence of my organism was taking me through fight, flight, and freeze. And sometimes liberating me into what people might call, ventral vagal or communication systems. But that fight, flight, freeze, going into that wasn't something I had to either just resign myself to or try to fight. That was just a natural process of having a deep tear, which is what this loss has been.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have conflicting emotion or conflict. Feldenkrais called it parasitic contractions in the body. You try to do one thing, but you're holding yourself back from it. And through much of my life and my wife's life, we
I'm
just,
so sorry for your loss, by the way. I know it's recent. I'm very sorry for your loss.
and I really appreciate that so much, um, because that was our whole life. 53 years together,
Yeah.
51 years of marriage.
Yeah.
And
Amazing.
that was her whole life, and it was my whole life up to this point. It seems, I don't know how everybody would feel about this, but she's still here with me just as strongly as she was. It's not just the memories. It's so that's a good thing. Yeah. But we had a lot of tools. Had she died a year earlier, it would have been devastating. But after that last year we spent together, uh, I think you do various forms of meditation also. Is that correct? Or yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious if I could ask you, like, because what made the last year so powerful with you and your wife?
It is a practice in some places to meditate on your own death.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't do that as a formality, but she deeply, and both of us deeply accepted our mortality in a way that we never have before.
Mm-hmm.
And once you do that, it just changes everything. My wife, if we're going there for a minute, I was going to say we spend a lot of our time doing, you talked about fight or flight or freeze. Well, we fight life. That's one we fight it, and that's what causes our suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife suffered a lot of depression. Now, I don't want to characterize our whole marriage as depression,
Mm-hmm.
but there was some deep depression with her over, the trauma of growing up that we talked about, never being good enough, never being accepted as part of the family, put out of your own family, and you never had that feeling of a mother who cared for you because she was gone when you were a little girl.
Mm-hmm.
Then you were told to, be strong for your father.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the last year, because I think strongly before that last year, even before the diagnosis, we were wanting to change our priorities also. But in that last year, she was never depressed. It was gone. And she knew that she was greatly healed, not cured of the cancer. That it wasn't meant to be. But she knew that her life was forever changed. If she got well, there's a tendency to forget, but if she got well, she knew that no matter what, her life was changed forever because those priorities had changed.
Yeah.
What really is important? Your family, who's with you, where life has brought you, what you can offer. Your mortgage, yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
what you want to do today, no, it doesn't compare.
Mhm. Yeah.
There was even a conversation I had because we were going through quite a bit, even before the diagnosis there. And yeah, I think she wanted to do something and brought it up, and I kind of wanted to do something else. And my response was, and she detected that, and my response was, it doesn't matter. And oh, yes, it does. I said, no, it really doesn't. And then we came to that point where no, nothing really does matter except the things that really matter.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's very profound change when you say that somebody has wrestled with trauma all their life and then it's gone. It wasn't gone. She just didn't have time for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, that's that.
It's very beautiful. I'm very glad you had that time with her.
And that is,
Wonderful.
so we learned very well that you can be sad and joyful at the same time. They're not separate.
Yeah.
Was the saddest year of our marriage, but the most joyful.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I was able to take care of her and be with her until the last, which is what she wanted. And I've heard people say, you know, you're kind of glad when you don't have to do that anymore, but
Mhm.
not so much.
Mhm.
And she made it beautiful. Uh, so
What was her name? Her first name?
Leanne, her name was
Leanne.
Lee and her middle name was Ann. We called her Leanne.
Nice.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So but those tools, there are a number of them, and your attitude towards life. What you said was that we all, I have to paraphrase, I can't remember exactly what you said, but that we all have, you can't, you can't get the good things without the suffering or without the
Yeah.
trauma or without the other things. And that is so true because we think, especially as children, uh, we think that life is all about getting what you want all the time. And it can't possibly be about that. It just doesn't work out that way. Unless what you want is the very most important things. And then you can always have it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this interview is supposed to be about you,
Okay. That's
but this is what you were talking about, though.
Oh, absolutely. Yesterday, actually, I live in Western Massachusetts. And there, I was at the library the other day, and there's this new book out about, it's like a homegrown kind of book. It's mostly photographs, but it's about all of the native places. It's mostly photographs, and it outlines all of the indigenous tribal people who were here before the white people. And I hadn't known, I was so ignorant, I hadn't known that Thanksgiving is a day of mourning for Native Americans. And it seems like, I don't know about other parts of the country, but here there's a lot of documentation about the interactions between the quote unquote settlers and the quote unquote Native Americans. And so I was thinking like, yeah, like that's really important to mourn because I walk all through this land. We have a lot of conservation land here. And I'm walking, hiking, cycling, swimming. And I think about the people who were here early before white people were here. And it was just really interesting to be out in the woods yesterday and like hold those two things together, that it was such a gorgeous day. And being that it's Massachusetts, you can't always expect a gorgeous day on Thanksgiving. It could be a blizzard.
Yeah.
So holding that, the beauty of the day, the wonder of the day, the happiness for family and connections on Thanksgiving, and at the same time, the absolute assault on the human beings that really represented what this place is at a deeper core than any of the pioneers or settlers or colonial people that are so prevalent in everything we see in Massachusetts, where
Uh, History is taught in schools to children. It's that if I don't want to say too much, but I'd say it's certainly superficial.
it's very superficial, yeah. And that also has been a big practice since my son died. It's like, well, okay, so I got married in a year after my son died, I got married. And, quite out of left field, surprise, wonderful experience. And my daughter's pregnant, I'm gonna have a grandchild. So there's all of this wonder and joy and beauty. And so a real practice for me has been like not falling into one or the other, like not dwelling on the fact that my son's not here, but at the same time not closing that out, allowing myself to continue to feel the depth of that loss, which often means tears,
Yeah.
and at the same time really letting myself feel the joy and wonder of life. It's really been a personal practice.
Yeah. I hadn't felt a whole lot of loss in some ways right away because Leanne's presence was so strong with me. And
Mm-hmm.
yesterday, I could see kind of what brought it up, but I had a moment of loss that was so strong that it was actually physically painful. And not long after that, I had a moment of reconnection to myself and strength that was also beautiful, or almost hard to understand. So,
I do remember when Michael, that's my son, when he first died, I got, it's so weird, I almost hesitate to say it, but I know it's been kind of written about and commented on, this idea of like exquisite suffering. Like my suffering was so great. I mean, this
oh,
was my first child. We were very close. It was unexpected. He had a non-COVID related blood clot, and we didn't know. We found out months later that he had 3 different genetic factors that predisposed him to blood clotting, and we didn't know. We knew there was something tricky about his health, but no matter the regular medical doctors or holistic people we took him to, never mentioned getting genetic testing. And, or particularly, there's no way to look, like, why would you look for that? And so he had this clot and it killed him. And my suffering was so great but there were these moments of like, there's a Lakota Sioux quote about how people who are in the midst of suffering are considered the most blessed because, to paraphrase, you have the most access to God. Like there's no filter, there's no screen. And that in that tradition, you ask people who are in the height of suffering to pray for you because they are just in this depth of life. And I think I felt that a bit in the sense that this suffering was so intense, but there was an exquisiteness about it too, a truth, a kind of transparency
yeah,
to deeper life at the same time. But there is
yeah,
such pain.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, and even you're honoring that loved one by feeling that. Yeah, that's part of what you're saying,
Absolutely.
I think. Not all, yeah. You're intensely alive and
I,
compassionate and in touch with those experiences that you're talking about. So
absolutely.
now we started the interview with your story, and we got into a lot of things about grief and loss. So let's now go on a little bit more and talk about tools people can use to live a more pleasant, more enjoyable, or more resilient life. There's you hear about so many different kinds of yoga. Restorative yoga is one we're hearing about now, and uh, to a lot of people, it just means more flexibility, even to an extreme, even to the place where you damage yourself.
Mhm.
But what is it for you, and what's the real value that people could look for in yoga? And so first tell us what somatics is.
Oh, that's such a good question.
Yeah,
Oh, I wish I wrote that down.
yeah.
Well, so as a somatic practitioner, so I'm a member of ISMETA, International Somatic Movement and Therapists Association. And so it's an umbrella group. Actually, the Feldenkrais Guild is in the umbrella group, the Alexander Technique, Continuum, and
Could you
there's
say the
just
name of that again?
ISMETA, ISMETA. It's a
IS
wonderful, powerful organization uniting our profession around the globe.
ISMETA.
TA, smeta.org is the website. And so on that website, and I don't have it there, there are standards and vision and kind of what are the common denominators that tie all types of somatic practitioners together. And some of that is that we are able to look at bodies and see where they're not moving optimally and help with gentle insight and a lot of self-sensing, a lot of, what is now being called maybe interoception, being able to sense yourself from the inside out to find places of more ease and integration. And that this is reflected in brain plasticity, and that as we do this, our brains change, we approach the world differently. There's certainly a branch of somatic movement practitioners who are interested in creativity. The Anna Halpern School, for instance, they do a lot with mythology and dance and creativity. We have many people in the organization who are working with somatics in education, so that giving children and young adults somatic movement approach can help them to learn better. And of course, there are psychotherapists who are interested in using conscious movement to help people overcome trauma and loss. In my personal practice, I've had a good deal of therapists who have come to me for help with their own ability to feel themselves from the inside out and to be more authentic and more intelligent in their own movement. There's physical fitness applications as you're doing and you talk about on your website. But I think the umbrella of all of this is how to really support people being more of their innate humanness. That all of this kind of habit and patterning and interruption with our full humanity is not separate from how we move. How we move and think and feel are really tied together. And by entering through movement, we can have profound and yet gentle, lasting change.
Okay, so
How does that sound to you as a somatic practitioner?
it sounds great. Um, so one thing you said is that you can sense how people are moving, so you might deal with people who are moving painfully but don't realize the pain is caused by their movement. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And then,
Absolutely.
and then can you make clear to people why um, this, okay, so there could be somatic education in a general sense, and there could actually be something that people would term somatic therapy. Feldenkrais didn't want to call it that, although it has therapeutic effects.
Of
But
course.
therapeutic therapy is actually designed to be therapeutic. That's the intent, right? And so, can you tell people why would I come to somebody who uh, is a movement specialist or a somatic specialist if I had inner turmoil?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think most people, in my own practice through the years, I find most people do come because of physical pain. That maybe, they've gone to the gym, they've gone to PT, they get massage, they still have it. It's like, oh, okay, really? Maybe this is about how I'm moving. So physical pain's kind of easy to, associate. And the emotional is a little bit different. But I think what's happening now is that because of Peter Levine and somatic experiencing, and also because of Bessel van der Kolk, is that his name? I can't think of it right now. And Stephen Porges, that people who work with trauma are starting to recognize that you can't just approach trauma from the mind, that trauma is, as they say, the issues are in the tissues. And so realizing that it's, what's that wonderful Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps its score. So whatever has happened to us, so, from a more physical perspective, I think it was a Feldenkrais example, the person who always keeps the wallet in their back pocket, and so they sit on the wall and their pelvis gets imbalanced, so they get lower back pain. Like,
Yeah.
we do the same thing with our emotions.
Mhm.
Whatever emotions we have habitually, either because of practice or because of big trauma, that contorts our tissue. That can change and does change the shape of our body. It affects how we move. And in that, it makes us less resilient. It's almost like something's lodged in there. And if you can get it to move and shift physically, you can also get the emotion to shift and or become more resilient. So when something difficult happens, you just have more bandwidth to deal with it
Right.
because you have more. And I really do think this was at the essence of what Feldenkrais was saying all along.
Mhm.
But, now it's more out in the open because it's becoming more considered that you can't do therapy from your head. You have to integrate your body into therapy.
Yeah. Some of Feldenkrais's books are not able to be understood when you pick them up if you don't have that idea that that trauma is carried in the body. I have known people that this is how this is just where they're at, and
Yeah.
there is nothing that we can, uh, no state that we can live in that doesn't affect the body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same thing that the body affects our states, like,
Okay, I like
yeah,
that. I like that
yeah,
because so that means that we can uncover some things within ourselves and actually build our own self-awareness period by noticing what's going on in the body.
yeah,
So if we notice what's going on in the body, we're going to notice a lot about our own habits and about our own life and way of living. On the other
yeah,
hand, if you know some of those things already, and maybe a big revelation for me was the mind and body, or the brain and body, being one whole unity rather than separate, because I'm not the only one, I don't think. I know I'm not, in this country, that lives mainly in their mind. Uh, so if you know certain things about yourself, you know what emotions you're carrying, and what emotions you would like to carry in a certain situation, you can actually use somatic practices as a tool to attain that. So you can go either way. Feldenkrais, there was a story that he gave a lesson to someone who was depressed, and when they got up, they said, "What have you done to me? I'm not depressed." Of course, you can be depressed again if you want to.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But
And if, it becomes a habit, I mean, I think that's what we're learning too, is that if you practice things enough, it's also, you create a chemistry.
practicing what?
If you practice like depression, like, is it the chicken or the egg? Like, does chemistry create depression, or then does the practicing of depression create more of the chemistry of depression?
Right, right.
It's a horrible.
So you can use this either way. You can use this for self-examination, certainly, and to particularly to view your habits. Your habits,
Yeah, to change them.
yeah,
To
they might
change
not be viewable other
Right.
than when you begin to look at how you move.
Yeah, Bonnie Cohen has a quote. It's like, I'm coming from left field here, but it's like, if you want to know how the wind is blowing, you look at the sand, the body is the sand.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So I think if this sounds, if you're completely unfamiliar with it, it might sound very unfamiliar. But I think if anybody would take a few moments to really get inside their body, they would experience some knowing. So what type of yoga do you practice now?
Donna yoga.
What is it?
I don't really practice the type of yoga.
Okay, you're mainly a somatic practitioner.
Yeah, I mean, I do a little of what might be called yoga here and there. I mean, yeah, I have a lot of love and respect for yoga, but I don't really do it as a practice. And I see yoga largely, the gift of it is helping people really regulate their autonomic nervous system. I think that's a really important gift of yoga, actually.
So I think maybe I don't know for sure, but I think that a lot of yogic traditions, if you carry it back far enough, don't have too much to do with poses.
Mm-hmm.
They have more to do with the practice of regulating the nervous system, and yeah.
Yeah.
So
And then eventually, reaching some type of higher consciousness.
yeah. So tell us now, if someone came to you and they wanted to change a habit, or they wanted to improve their life, or they simply had so much of something going inside them that was disturbing their nervous system. Or we could use more understandable words, maybe trauma or tension or difficulties. Uh, what would you like them to know, or what would you do with them?
Well, one of the things that I'll do a lot of is just getting people to actually take the time to experience gravity and gravity's effect on the body. So not in a negative way, not like, oh, gravity's pulling me down, I'm sagging, but that actually gravity as a holding, encompassing force.
Mm.
And that also has to do with being able to go inside and experience the volume of your own body and how that interacts with gravity. And for people who have a lot of anxiety and who don't ground very well, that's really, really useful, a really useful practice. People come with such different things. I had a new person come to me today, and she has a little issue with her pelvic floor, and she's been reading all kinds of things on the internet. So for instance, she was reading her ribs should flare like a bell when she breathes in. versus her belly expanding. So, okay, fair enough. Like, she's like, I think when my belly expands, I put too much pressure on my pelvic floor. Fair enough. But so then it was like, okay, let's look at the actual movement of the diaphragm, because that's like a layer deeper than flaring out your ribs when you breathe in. It's like if you can experience the diaphragm as a jellyfish, which, you know, we could use that as a metaphor for this miracle of evolution that has this kind of movement between its own sense, its own diaphragm and the ribs, then automatically when you inhale, you're going to have rib flare. You're going to feel movement that's more circular rather than just your belly expanding. And guess what? You can sense the naturalness of this. Can you let it come alive? Versus you thinking like, okay, now I'm inhaling, let me expand my belly. If I expand my ribs,
Yeah.
then my pelvic floor is going to be safe, you know?
It becomes mechanical. Yeah.
So yes, so the experiential anatomy that's based in reality is helpful for people who come with a specific issue. If it is more emotional, again, I mentioned the gravity and grounding. If people are very depressed, I actually will go more for the sympathetic. So maybe they need to experience pushing and pulling, or throwing balls or bouncing balls, especially like pushing, like people who would feel like very like hunkered in and caved in and like they don't have space, just even getting them to understand like what is contact, like what is the neutral of contact, what is it for one person. I'm losing my there. What is it for a person to experience another person without drawing away from them or overlording it over them? Where's that moment? And then in that moment, if you could even find that moment, and sometimes people who are really in themselves have a hard time just finding this moment, then what is it like to push? Can you push without pushing the other person over? Can you just kind of start to create like a boundary? So these are a couple examples of how I might work with people. I have another woman who just had foot surgery, and I mean, there are things that are fused with, nuts and bolts now, more in the front of her foot. So we've been working with gaining more movement in the back of the foot. How do the bones of the ankle go over the foot? What does that do between the heel and the talus bone? How can that change in your foot? So the foot is more resilient. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
And with grief and loss a lot, it is like, can I slow down enough to have an experience in my body without thinking that that experience defines all of me? So, if someone is very, I don't know, just like strung out in their nervous system, I might go into, well, if your brain and your nerves are a creature and they're constantly trying to get information to bring in and then, create motor activity. And this is like a 20, 25, 30-minute process of dropping down enough to start to feel the organic nature of just the brain and the sensory motor nerves, just with no particular intention other than to let that be an organism that's alive.
Wow. Okay, so your website has quite a bit of information on it, and you have a lot of videos for people to explore and get to know you. Actually, you have inspired me quite a bit by what I can see here as your wholehearted dedication to somatics and to learning as much as you can there and to applying it for people. Would you want to say a word or two about any somatic practices that help you through the day?
That's interesting. It kind of shifts all the time. Like I'll get fascinated with something or feel like I've been having like some acid reflux. So I've been really like thinking about the ligaments. I mean, this is so arcane. Most people are not going to go here, but I'm thinking about the moving my diaphragm and the crura around the esophagus. And I'm thinking about another ligament that a friend of mine who's a body worker showed me, the ligament of Treitz that is between the stomach and the small intestine. And so, I mean, this is like minutia. Only someone like me or you would bother to get into this most likely. But so it shifts, if I were like, let's say I have 2 torn meniscus that I've never done anything with medically, I had since I was pretty young. And so, if I'm hiking a lot and I'm misstepping, then I may like focus on the function of my knee for a while. It's less about somatic practices. I think over the years, the kind of principles of somatics really stick with me, introduce something that's different and that is more integrated, and be really gentle with it. Don't push with it. See how your body responds to it and trust that. See where that takes you. The other person who influenced me a great deal that I didn't mention was Emily Conrad, Daoud Continuum, which she was much less structured than Feldenkrais or Mani. Like there was less of a construct of how the body operates. It was more just like experiencing waves and pulses and vibrations that would lead you from the inside into outward movement. But it influenced me a great deal because it just makes me respectful that there's an ecology in here that wants to express itself.
Right, so that your somatic tools have become more of a somatic successful learning experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. And I feel like I always still have more to learn. I mean, we're in a rich field and it's a pretty new field, and there are just a lot of really dedicated people, and I also think like we call it a field because there's a name and a label. And I know Martha Eddy, she's done like a historical sort of analysis of the field, starting with people like Mabel Todd and Charlotte Silver. So she has a whole, like family tree, which is really fascinating and great and cool. And then I know other people feel like, well, what's the big deal? This is Qigong. The Chinese have been doing this for centuries, and this is all in traditional African martial arts and dance. And there's a truth to that too. It's a human expression if we let it be.
Yeah.
It's not just this precious thing called somatics.
Yeah. Okay, so what was the name of the person there that had the family tree sort of thing?
Martha Eddy, Eddy, and I don't know her website offhand. She's in Manhattan, and she's very much kind of taken on the role of historian for our field.
Somebody might find that interesting. Yeah.
Oh, very fascinating. Yeah. I think there's a course actually on the ISMETA website. There's a course on the history and family tree of somatics that's free.
I'll have to look into that actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me what you think.
Okay.
Good.
Donna, would you like to tell everyone how to find your website?
Yes, it's originalbodywisdom.com. And I'm located in Western Massachusetts, but I also work over Zoom. I have regular weekly classes, and I occasionally do workshops, and I see a few people one-on-one over Zoom as well, which is kind of remarkable to me, but it came about during COVID and it works. So
originalbodywisdom.com.
Yeah. Yep.
Donna, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're so welcome. I really appreciate you having me, and definitely let's stay in touch and tell me what you think about the ISMETA website and anything else we touched base with.
Okay. I definitely have that in mind to stay in touch. Let's end it for now, and let's see where we can go from here. So right now, goodbye, everyone.
All right.